Welcome back to class. At the end of Joshua, the people of God made a vow that they will keep the covenant. They will be a covenant-keeping nation. That's what they told Joshua. Now listen to this verse, Joshua 24, 16 to 18. Then the people answered, "Far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods. For it is the Lord our God who brought us and our fathers up from the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, and who did those great signs in our sight, and preserved us in all the way that we went, and among all the people through whom we passed. And the Lord drove out before us all the people, the Amorites who lived in the land. Therefore, we also will serve the Lord, for he is our God." So that is what they told Joshua before Joshua died. You know, when I was reading this thing, it reminded me of the things that we say as believers today. There are so many things that we talk about, kind of like as a matter of fact. We've kind of learned the language of Christianity. We have the vocabulary of Christians and how Christians speak and what Christians say, and just the verbiage of Christianity. And we say things, we sing things, we pray things that we don't really mean. And so as I was reading this, I was thinking, that's exactly what these guys were doing. Maybe when they say it, they were sincere, but their actions going forward doesn't show that. And so learn from these guys. Are the things that you're saying to yourself about your faith, to God about him, and to people about Christianity, do you really believe those things? Or are you just saying them because the emotion of the moment has caught up with you, and now you feel like that is the right thing to say at that particular moment? As soon as Joshua dies, they turned from God and started worshiping other gods. Look at Judges 17:6. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And it's repeated again in 18:1, 19:1, and 21:25. So this is kind of like a recurring theme towards the end of the book of Judges, that there was no king among them, and everybody did in their sight what they thought was right. Now, unlike Moses, Joshua doesn't have a replacement to lead Israel. And there's a very good reason for this. The expectation, number one, is that the Israelites will submit themselves under the leadership of God to reign over them as a nation, with some help from the elders that were appointed by Moses and Joshua in the desert. Now, but there's a big difference right now. The community now, the Israel that we knew in the desert, is not the Israel that we know in the promised land. In the promised land, the government now is decentralized. They're not looking up to one leader to tell them what to do. They have several leaders among them that need to lead them to take over to drive out the Canaanites and the nations that are around them. So they didn't have that one unifying leader. That was supposed to be God for them, but apparently that did not happen. So they were no longer moving in one crowd, but they had been decentralized, and they lived according to their tribes. So the tribe of Judah lived as the tribe of Judah. The tribe of Manasseh lived as the tribe of Manasseh. The tribe of Reuben lived as the tribe of Reuben. They were not moving together the way they did in the wilderness. So in a sense, the tribes were no longer united. So Judges, what about the title? Where does the title Judges come from? So the title of this book in the Hebrew Bible is Shofetim. And Shofetim literally means judges. The English title Judges comes to us from the Latin translation of the Bible. Some of you know it as the Latin Vulgate, which the Greek translation Septuagint influenced. So in all four languages, both in Hebrew, in English, in Latin, and in Greek, all those four languages, the title means judges. This title is somehow misleading. Why do I say that? Because most English speakers, when they hear the word judge, they are thinking of the judges that sit in court to arbitrate between two opposing factions. That is not what the judges of Israel were. So as we shall see then, these people were very different from the judges as we know them right now. And again, the book, just like the book of Joshua, does not receive its title from from the person that authored the book, but from its principal characters, who are the judges. Now, we don't know who the author is, but the tradition of the Jews, or the Jewish tradition, most of them think that it is Samuel who wrote the book of Judges. There's a commentary I was reading, and I like what they said about the judges. They had no power, these judges, they had no power to make laws, for these were given by God, nor to explain them, for that was the province of the priests. But they were officially upholders of the law, defenders of religion, avengers of all crime, particularly of idolatry and its attendant vices. I think that that's a very good way of thinking about the judges when you think about them. So the message of the book of Judges is, the book of Judges is the story of what happened after Joshua and his generation died. And the story of that generation that remains is not a very good one. Israel needs a godly king chosen by God to unite the tribes, because they're not united at the moment. As sinful and rebellious as the Israelites were, God still showed them tremendous love and mercy. And you're thinking, how did he do that? Now, think about this. Every time the children of Israel break the covenant, and it's very interesting that they, in their idolatry, were breaking the first commandment to not have any other God apart from Yahweh, who brought them from Egypt now into the promised land that they are enjoying. But every time they broke that, every time they fell away, every time they were oppressed because of their sin, God would bring about a deliverer to get them out of their oppression. For me, this is a really big show of God's love and God's mercy. Now, what is the outline of the Judges? Very simple. Judges chapter 1 and 2, and then 3 to 16, and then 17 to 21. In chapter 1 and 2, we see the spiritual condition of the Israelites. It wasn't very good. They adopted gods and traditions of the Canaanites. And then in chapter 3 to 16, we see the 7 sin cycles of the Israelites. And this is where you see judgment, repentance, and deliverance. And then chapter 17 to 21 is a spiritual collapse of the Israelites. And here is where you see rival worship, immorality, intertribal wars, and apostasy. So let's go and look at this one at a time. Chapter 1 of Judges and chapter 2, the spiritual condition of the Israelites. One of the reasons why the children of Israel did not have a good and strong spiritual life was because of the disobedience to God's command of driving out the nations around them. And when you look at this, it can look very unfair. Why is God telling people to destroy other people? God did that because he knew that these people were going to be an evil influence to Israel, and they're going to turn them away from him to worship other gods and idols. And in this specific instance, the gods were the Baals. The author does not want you to miss the problem that is facing the nation. He goes into a detailed account of how the children of Israel did not drive out their enemies from their land. So listen to this. Chapter 1, verse 27. Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth-Shean and its villages. Verse 28. They put the Canaanites to forced labor, but did not drive them out completely. 29. And Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites who lived in Gezer. Verse 30. Zebulun did not drive out the inhabitants of Kitron. Verse 31. Asher did not drive out the inhabitants of Akko. Verse 32. So the Asherites lived among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land, for they did not drive them out. Naphtali did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh. Are you beginning to see a pattern here? God told them, drive these people out. But over and over, there is this repetition that they did not drive them out. Now, the consequences of the disobedience will be and is very evident all over the entire book of Judges. But so is the grace of God. Remember in the last class what we said, that God was their king and they were the subjects. And God will bring warnings and commands down to them. And the way they respond to those warnings and commands will determine whether they get blessings or they get curses. So if they respond in unbelief and disobedience, then the result was death, destruction, and curses. But if they responded in faith and obedience, then the result was life, prosperity, and blessings. So you see, that is chapter 1 and 2. So the second section is chapter 3 to chapter 16. And this is where the majority, this is kind of like the body of this book and what was going on in this book. And we have something called the 7 sin cycles. Why is it called the 7 sin cycle? It's because God carried his judgment out in cycle as characterized in the lives of the Israelites and the book of Judges. And for over 300 years, Israel went through this cycle. And it looks something like this. The Israelites sin by worshiping Baals or other gods. This violates the covenant and provokes God to anger. And then number 3, the Lord hands them over to their enemies. Then under oppression from their enemies, they cry out to God for deliverance. Then the Lord raises up a military leader or a judge to deliver them from their oppression. This is what happened. And 7 times we will see this played out over and over again. They will sin against God and go through this cycle, and then God will deliver them, and then they'll forget that God delivered them. Then they will do it again and again and again, 7 different times. And during this time, God will raise up 12 judges to deliver Israel from their oppressors. Judges chapter 2, verse 16 says this. Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of these raiders or the hands of their oppressors. I'm going to go through a list of these judges and you see what was happening during that time. The first judge is called Othniel. Othniel is the brother of Caleb. Now he was brought by God because the children of Israel were oppressed by the Edomites for 8 years. But God used Othniel to deliver his people from them. And after the deliverance, they had 40 years of peaceful existence. They lived in peace for 40 years. But then they forgot again. And the Moabites come in, and the Moabites oppress them for 18 years. And then God raises up Ehud and Shamgar, and God uses these 2 people to deliver his people from them, and they had 80 years of peace. And then comes in the Canaanite. After they forget again, they jump back into sin, and the Canaanites come in and oppress them for 20 years. But God uses Deborah to deliver these people from the Canaanites, and they had 40 years of living in peace. And then again, they forget, and they again fall back into sin. And this time, they are oppressed by the Midianites for 7 years. But then God raises up a judge called Gideon, and Gideon delivers them from them, and they had 40 years of peace. But then they fall back again into sin. And this time, the Midianites come back again and oppress Israel for 3 years. But God uses Tola and Jair to deliver his people from them, and they had 45 years of peaceful living. But again, they forget. And again, they fall back into sin. This time to the Ammonites, and they are oppressed for 18 years. But God uses Jephthah to deliver his people from them, and they had 31 years of peaceful existence. But during this time, Jephthah only rules for 6 years. After Jephthah, we have a guy called Ibzan. Ibzan rules for 7 years. Then Ibzan dies. And then we have this guy called Elon. Elon rules for 10 years. And then he dies. And then we have a guy called Abdon. He rules for 8 years. So during these 31 years of peace, they've had 4 judges that have kind of led them through this time. And then finally, the final cycle is the Philistine. And the Philistine comes and they oppress them for a record 40 good years. But then during that time, God raises a judge called Samson to deliver his people from them. And they had 20 years of peace. So you see this, that the successive judges became more and more flawed. Israel now embraced, they didn't only practice this, but they embraced debauchery, rape, and murder. And you can see this in Judges 19. So at last, the nation is divided by civil war. The last of the judges, as we saw above, is Samson. And Samson is a very interesting guy because he becomes an image of what Israel herself had become. When you look at his story in Judges 13 to 16, this becomes very clear. But it's very interesting that the story of Samson ends with this statement. Thus Samson killed more when he died than while he was alive. Judges 16:30. But Samson's, like I said, complex life symbolized what Israel itself had become. They had disregarded God's law and God's covenant. They had fatal attraction to foreign gods and foreign women, etc., etc. And you can just see like the story of Samson is almost like the summary of what the children of Israel had done to God. So but the interesting thing is that Samson is not only one of the Israelites. He is actually their leader. So finally, the last section of this book, Judges 17 to 21, the spiritual collapse of the Israelites. Now, the last 5 chapters in the book of Judges, they talk about selective events that occurred during the period of the Judges that illustrates just how deep the Israelites had fallen away from God, how far they were away from the God who got them out of Egypt. So these stories kind of are put here by the author to show you just a little snippet of how far these guys had fallen into sin. And if you look at your textbook, there's a very good summary in there on page 29 of these little events and little stories. Now, the book of Judges begins and ends with war. The interesting part of this is that at the beginning, it was a holy war. They were fighting for God against pagan nations. But at the end, they are engaged in war fighting against each other. And it's a very interesting depiction or picture of the church today. We have a big enemy, the devil, that is day and night looking at ways to destroy what God is building here on earth, his kingdom through his church. It doesn't take much to see how vile Christians have become to one another. All you have to do is just one click on Twitter and see how Christians are just ugly to one another. So we have stopped fighting the enemy, and now we are fighting each other. And that's what happens when Christians become comfortable. When we have conquered everything that needs to be conquered and build our big churches and have our nice little kingdoms here on earth. And then we are divided into our little denominational tribal cocoons. And now this denomination is fighting this denomination because of this kind of doctrine and that kind of doctrine. That is not why Christians are on this earth, to fight each other. We are supposed to be burden bearers of one another. Our enemy is not each other. Our enemy is Satan, the devil. And so you look at these guys here, at the beginning they start well. They're fighting the holy war. They're fighting for God against pagan nation. At the end, when you read this book, it's very sad to see that these tribes that came out of Egypt together, that came through the wilderness and saw the hand of God, and before Joshua promising that they're going to keep the commands of God, they don't. Now they're fighting one another. And the point here is, this is what happens when people decide that they are their own standards of right and wrong. That I don't have anyone that tells me what to do. That the standards of what is right and what is wrong is me and what I feel. So throughout Judges, we see the tendency of the Israelites to do what was right in their own eyes. Judges 17, 6 and 21, 25. So by the time of the last judge, Samson, the Israel's ruler, he himself, Samson, habitually obeyed no higher authority because he himself was the authority. His mission was not being driven by the good, perfect, acceptable will of God. It was being driven by his own corrupt will. So as the book ends, it sets the stage for the book of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. Because see how it ends. Judges 21, 25. In those days, there was no king in Israel. So everyone did in their eyes as they pleased. And it is screaming, please give us a king. Please give us a king. Because they have no king. And so Judges have set a stage of why these guys need a king to unify them as a tribe. But before we get to Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles, we have to go the book of Ruth. So see you in the next class as we tackle the book of Ruth.